Have you ever wondered why a man, even after decades, can still feel haunted by the ghost of the woman who chose to walk away first? It is not her face alone that lingers in the recesses of his unconscious, nor the way she spoke, nor even the warmth of her touch. What he remembers forever is the symbolic rupture, the moment she shattered the illusion that he controlled the tempo of their story. When a woman leaves before he is ready, she seizes the archetype of power from his hands. She forces him to confront not only her absence, but also the parts of himself he has spent years denying. In that moment, she becomes less of a woman and more of a myth carved into his psyche. Carl Jung wrote of the anima, the inner feminine that lives inside every man. She is the mirror through which he learns to love, the vessel of his desires and projections. When the external woman who carried his anima image departs, something devastating occurs. He is stripped of his illusion that she belonged to him. Suddenly he must face the emptiness inside, the shadow he tried to hide beneath her presence. That is why the man remembers forever the one who left first, because she carried with her a fragment of his soul he thought was secure. And you, listening now, must understand the depth of this truth. Men often do not grieve the woman herself, but the collapse of the story they wove around her. He remembers how her silence exposed his dependence, how her absence revealed the fragility of his ego. You see, when a woman leaves before he can discard her, she becomes the embodiment of his unfinished business. She is the symbol of the power he lost, the lesson he cannot unlearn, the reminder that no man, no matter how strong, can fully possess the soul of another. Psychologists often describe attachment as a wound dressed in the garments of romance. A man may project onto a woman the salvation he secretly craves. He thinks she will cure his loneliness, silence his inner critic, or prove to the world that he is worthy of love. But Jung would caution, projection is a dangerous spell, for sooner or later the veil is lifted. And when she is the one to lift it, when she refuses to play the role of savior, the rupture cuts deep. He remembers forever not because she betrayed him, but because she refused to betray herself. Imagine the imprint this leaves. A man can dismiss the woman he abandons, he can bury her memory under new faces and louder distractions. But the woman who walks away first cannot be so easily buried. She is the one who dared to show him his own fragility. She forces him to admit that his control was only a mask, that his pride was hollow armor. In leaving, she became a permanent figure in his mythos, the initiator of his unwanted shadow work. She awakened in him the unbearable question, why was I not enough? And here lies the paradox. By leaving, she does not diminish herself in his eyes. On the contrary, she becomes larger than life. She becomes the one against whom he measures all others, not because she was perfect, but because she took away the illusion that love could be controlled. She entered his unconscious as both wound and oracle, as both absence and eternal presence. Jung would say she became part of his individuation, the painful process by which he must integrate his hidden truths, and so he remembers forever, not by choice, but by necessity. Do you see the power in this? Many women spend years clinging to men who no longer honor them, fearing that if they walk away, they will be forgotten. Yet the truth is the opposite. The woman who walks away first plants herself eternally in the soil of his psyche. She is not remembered for her tears, but for her silence. Not for her desperation, but for her refusal to settle. She is remembered because she embodied what he could not control: self-respect, detachment, sovereignty. And it is not only his heart that remembers. His ego does too, though it disguises the ache with pride. He may speak of her with bitterness, may diminish her name, may claim she meant little, but the very act of dismissal betrays the truth. He remembers. For the unconscious cannot be deceived by words. The shadow keeps her image alive, whispering to him in dreams, echoing in the quiet moments when no one else is there. He may never confess it openly, but his soul remembers forever. This is why leaving first is not merely an act of departure. It is an initiation, a crossing of thresholds, both for her and for him. She liberates herself from the cycle of waiting, and in doing so, she brands herself into his archetypal memory. He will forget the ones who begged, the ones who clung, the ones who accepted less than they deserved, but he will never forget the one who looked at him with clear eyes and said without words, "You will not define my worth." So ask yourself, when a man looks back over the landscape of his life, which woman leaves the sharpest mark on his memory? It is always the one who left first. And beneath his anger, his nostalgia, his stories told to friends, lies the unspoken truth. He remembers her because she forced him to meet himself. There is a reason silence feels heavier than words, and distance cuts deeper than confrontation. When a woman departs first, she robs the man of the narrative he had prepared in his mind. He may have imagined himself as the one with the final word, the one who would decide when the curtains would fall. Instead, her absence writes a story that denies him closure, and closure to a man's ego is more intoxicating than love itself. Without it, he lingers in a restless hunger, circling endlessly around the memory of her departure. Carl Jung believed that what we suppress in life does not vanish, but returns with vengeance in our unconscious. The man who is left before he was ready carries this suppression like a hidden stone in his chest. He may distract himself with new lovers, may drown himself in the noise of ambition, or may bury himself in routine. Yet none of it erases the archetype she awakened in him, the reminder that his power is finite, that his possession of her was an illusion. She becomes the face of the anima rejected, the mirror of his unfinished self. And you know this already, don't you? That men often chase what eludes them, not out of genuine love, but out of fear of emptiness. He remembers her because she denied him the script he relied upon. She did not plead, did not beg, did not hand him the comforting illusion that she would wait forever. She left. And in leaving, she showed him that his validation was no longer her currency. That revelation burns deeper than betrayal, because betrayal at least recognizes him as the center of the story. Her leaving, instead, exiled him from the stage altogether. In the masculine unconscious, abandonment by a woman has always carried the weight of myth. Think of Orpheus losing Eurydice, or Paris watching Helen taken away, or Tristan longing for Isolde. These are not just tales of lovers, they are projections of the eternal wound that men cannot heal with pride alone. The woman who leaves becomes part of that ancient narrative, whether she intended it or not. She becomes the symbol of the unattainable, the eternal muse, the unclaimed kingdom of the soul. He cannot destroy that symbol, for it does not belong to her body or her voice anymore. It belongs to his own psyche. He remembers the smallest details, though he may never admit it. The way she turned her face when she realized she had outgrown the story, the firmness in her walk as she closed the door, the subtle defiance in her silence when he tried to diminish her. These fragments become eternal echoes in him because they carry more than personal memory. They carry the essence of archetypal rupture. Jung would remind us, archetypes are not simply roles, they are forces that mold the soul itself. And she, in leaving first, awakened the archetype of the sovereign woman. Now think about this. How many men secretly measure every future relationship against the memory of the one who left? He may never confess this, but the shadow does not lie. Every new woman is unconsciously asked, will you leave me too? Will you stand where she stood, or will you remain in the comfort of dependence? This silent comparison poisons him, not because the new woman fails, but because the memory of the first departure was never integrated into his growth. He clings, he controls, he seeks dominance, all because he fears once more the unbearable silence of being discarded. And yet, here lies the true power of the feminine archetype. The woman who left does not even need to be present in his life to shape his behavior. She becomes, in absence, the hidden teacher of his individuation. If he has the courage, he may eventually face the wound she opened and realize that his worth cannot rest upon possession of another. But until then, he drags her shadow behind him like a chain. She has become his lesson, his mirror, his uninvited oracle. This is what many women do not realize. To leave first is not to be forgotten. It is to be remembered eternally, not as a fragile flame that flickered, but as the fire that burned through his illusions. And if he resents her, if he curses her name, if he speaks with disdain, it is only proof of the scar. Hatred is still connection, and resentment is still remembrance. Indifference belongs to those he conquered. Memory belongs to the one who conquered him. So ask yourself, what does a man truly remember forever? He does not remember the one who stayed past her worth. He does not remember the one who clung in desperation. He remembers the one who turned her silence into strength, the one who dared to detach before he was ready, the one who shattered his control. That memory is eternal, for it is tied not to her face, but to the lesson she carried in her leaving. There is a particular cruelty in realization, the kind that strikes a man when he understands too late what he has lost. The woman who departs first does not simply walk away from him, she dismantles the edifice of his self-importance. She confronts him with the stark truth that he was not the author of their ending. And for men, whose egos are often bound to conquest and control, this reversal is unforgettable. Her leaving is not merely an action in the external world. It becomes a symbol that penetrates the deepest levels of his psyche. Carl Jung often warned of the dangers of confusing possession with love. A man projects his anima onto a woman, unconsciously expecting her to complete him, to give shape to the inner void he cannot fill alone. When she walks away before he is ready, he feels betrayed by his own unconscious. It is as though the image he created of her has turned against him, refusing to obey. And because this projection is part of his soul, her departure feels like the theft of something sacred. She becomes the wound that will not close, the story that will not fade, the echo that continues long after her voice has vanished. Do you see the paradox? By leaving first, she becomes eternal in his memory, not because of romance, not because of sweetness, but because she forced him into confrontation with his shadow. He remembers her in flashes of anger, in sudden pangs of regret, in the hollowness that rises when silence replaces her presence. He cannot escape her because she has become more than herself. She has become the threshold he crossed unwillingly. Think of this in Stoic terms. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we must learn to let go of what is not within our control. Yet for a man, the hardest lesson is to accept that love, too, is beyond his dominion. He may master his fortune, his career, his reputation, but he cannot master the soul of a woman who chooses herself. And when she demonstrates this truth by leaving, she etches into him a scar more permanent than affection, the scar of powerlessness. He remembers it forever because it humbles him in ways the world never could. And what of the woman? What she often does not realize in the moment is that her courage to walk away places her in the role of initiator. She does not merely exit, she transforms. She ceases to be the passive recipient of his desire and becomes the sovereign of her own destiny. And in doing so, she assumes the archetypal role of the liberator, the one who redefines the story. He may curse her, he may long for her, but he cannot erase her because she became more than flesh and bone. She became the living symbol of his awakening. This is why men often recall with almost superstitious reverence the one who left them first. They may cover it in bravado, in bitterness, in dismissive laughter, but the truth seeps through. The woman who departs against the tide of his control represents the collapse of the ego's fortress. She proves that he is not invincible. She becomes, in his unconscious, a myth as powerful as any goddess or destroyer. Her image is not held in nostalgia, but in awe, the kind of awe that borders on fear. And you, hearing these words, must understand, men do not remember because they want to. They remember because they cannot escape. The unconscious does not release what has been carved into it with the sharp edge of loss. That is why, even years later, even after other loves, he may still dream of her face, may still recall her words, may still feel a pang when her name is spoken. She is not the woman he lost. She is the part of himself that he could never claim. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. For the man, it is not about her body, her beauty, or even her love. It is about the narrative she destroyed. He remembers because she forced him into shadow work he did not choose. She forced him to face his dependency, his pride, his illusions. And though he may fight against the lesson, though he may deny it with all the strength of his ego, the memory remains. Because once the anima is torn from projection and returned to its rightful place within, no man is ever the same. So the woman who leaves first is remembered forever, not as a weakness, but as the catalyst of his inner storm. She is remembered because she carried with her the mirror he tried to shatter. She is remembered because she revealed the truth he feared most, that no matter how much he desires control, love belongs to freedom, and freedom will never bow. What follows inside him is not merely longing, but a war between his ego and his soul. The ego rages, "She should have stayed, she owed me her devotion. She should have fought for me, as others have." Yet beneath the noise, the soul whispers a darker truth. She saw what you refused to see. She recognized that her destiny was not to orbit you. She left because her spirit demanded more, and though he resists it, the whisper is louder than the roar. That is why he remembers forever, because her absence is not silence, it is revelation. Carl Jung wrote of individuation as the journey toward wholeness, a process where one must integrate not only light but shadow. When a woman leaves first, she becomes the shadow in his myth, the part he cannot assimilate without pain. He may try to diminish her memory by reducing her to just another woman, but deep within, he knows this is a lie. She was the threshold. She was the fracture in his carefully constructed mask, and because individuation is not optional but inevitable, her leaving forces him to confront truths he was never prepared to face. This is why her figure lingers like a phantom. She represents the death of the illusion that he was untouchable. He can rewrite the story to friends, paint himself as the victim or as the conqueror, but the unconscious preserves the unaltered truth. She chose herself over him, and choice for a woman is the purest act of sovereignty. He remembers forever because that choice redefined not only their bond, but also his sense of self. You might not realize the sheer magnitude of this act. Most women are conditioned to wait, to hope, to beg for scraps of affection, believing that endurance is the proof of love. But the woman who chooses to walk away first breaks this ancient script. She refuses the role of the martyr. She refuses to dilute herself into shadow just to keep his flame burning. In her departure, she claims a power far greater than his validation, the power of self-respect. And that, more than any beauty or charm, is what he remembers until his final breath. Think of Seneca's counsel. He who is brave is free. Her leaving was not escape, it was bravery. She dared to be free, even if it meant being alone, even if it meant being misunderstood. And men remember freedom because it terrifies them. The free woman is a mirror they cannot control. She reflects back to them their insecurities, their dependency, their fragile egos. He remembers her not because she loved him more, but because she refused to love him less than she loved herself. In this lies the mystery of feminine power. It is not loud, not desperate, not flamboyant. It is quiet, steady, unshakable. The kind of power that does not beg, does not plead, does not barter. The power that says, "I will not stay where my spirit withers." That power is unforgettable because it awakens something primal in him, fear mixed with reverence. He remembers forever because her leaving was not abandonment, but initiation. She initiated him into the truth that love cannot be owned, that devotion must be chosen freely, and that no ego survives unchecked. And yet, what he remembers most is not her anger, nor her tears, but her silence. The silence of a woman who has already made peace with her decision carries a weight no man can lift. Words can be argued with, but silence leaves him alone with himself. And in that solitude, he sees clearly, she did not need him as he thought she did. That realization carves itself into his memory with the sharpness of a blade. So ask yourself, what greater legacy can a woman leave than the memory of her sovereignty? She may never know the depth of her imprint, may never witness the dreams where he searches for her face, may never hear the stories he tells to mask his regret. But none of that matters. For the truth is this: he remembers her because she embodied the one thing his ego could never destroy, the freedom to walk away. And in that freedom, she becomes eternal, not as a fragile memory, but as the embodiment of his unfinished growth. She is remembered forever because she was not conquered, she was not consumed, she was not broken. She walked away whole, and in doing so, she became the chapter he can never close. There comes a time, often years later, when the man sits in stillness and feels the gravity of what was lost. Not the dinners, not the laughter, not even the intimacy, but the presence of a woman who dared to choose herself over the comfort of his control. Memory sharpens in solitude, and as Jung taught, what is not integrated in the conscious mind re-emerges through dreams, symbols, and sudden aches of recognition. She appears not only in his recollections, but in the archetypes that haunt his inner world. She becomes Persephone, descending into the underworld, the muse who refused captivity, the sovereign who would not kneel. The tragedy is that he does not only remember her, he remembers himself through her absence. She is the mirror of the man he could have been, had he listened, had he valued, had he dared to confront his shadows before it was too late. And because he did not, she carries away the proof that his blindness cost him something irreplaceable. This is the kind of memory that matures into regret, not fleeting, not shallow, but the kind that drips slowly into the soul over decades. Epictetus once said, "You may fetter my leg, but my will not even Zeus himself can overpower." The woman who leaves first embodies this truth. She shows him that her will, her inner fire, cannot be shackled, and once he realizes it, long after she is gone, he cannot escape its echo. He remembers the will that would not bend. He remembers how her decision redefined his story, and the echo of that strength lives on in him, even if it wounds him with every recall. For you, the lesson is clear. A man remembers forever not because you stayed, not because you sacrificed, but because you departed with dignity. He remembers the moment you placed your worth above his approval, because that act is rare, almost sacred. Many women surrender themselves at the altar of fear, fear of loneliness, fear of rejection, fear of not being chosen. But the woman who leaves first transforms fear into fire, and that fire lights a torch in his memory that will never be extinguished. In Jungian terms, she becomes the anima's challenge, the feminine force that refuses to be a mere reflection of his desire. Instead, she demands to be recognized as whole, independent, sovereign. When she leaves, she pulls back the projection he placed upon her and hands it back to him like a mirror. This is why he cannot forget her. She forced him to face his own emptiness. She made him look into the abyss of his soul without her as shield. And once a man sees that abyss, he never unsees it. Notice how he responds after her departure. Some men collapse into bitterness, weaponizing their wounds against the women who follow. Others grow quieter, more contemplative, as though haunted by something they cannot name. A rare few rise to the challenge, integrating the lesson she left behind, maturing into a deeper kind of love. But no matter which path he takes, her shadow walks beside him. She is etched into the fabric of his becoming because she carried the archetype of freedom into his life and then out of it. And if you have ever wondered, will he forget me? Will my leaving mean nothing? You must abandon this fear. For forgetting belongs to trivial encounters, but your sovereignty is not trivial. He may forget the way you dressed, the words you spoke, the details of your time together. But he will not forget the shift in his soul when you left. He will not forget the way you dismantled his illusion of control. He will not forget that you walked away whole, unbroken, unapologetic. This is why men often remember with reverence the woman who left, even if they mask it in resentment. Resentment is not indifference, it is proof of the wound. They may curse, they may minimize, they may deny, but in the hidden chambers of their psyche, they know she was the one who chose her freedom, and that choice, more than any tender moment, brands itself into eternity. And so the cycle continues. He walks forward, older, wiser perhaps, but always carrying the memory of her absence. She, on the other hand, does not look back. She has already stepped into a new horizon, a horizon born not of need, but of choice. And in that choice lies the ultimate paradox. He remembers her forever, precisely because she no longer needed to be remembered. The woman who leaves first becomes timeless, not because she sought eternity, but because she embraced herself. And that is the essence of Jung's teaching. When the individual chooses authenticity over illusion, they become more than a passing figure in another's story. They become an archetype, unforgettable and eternal. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.